behalf of Festival co-directors Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple, and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, welcome back to JLF's Brave New World. Those of you who missed all our earlier sessions featuring the amazing list of brilliant speakers and writers, including His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Piku Iyer, Margaret Atwood, Neil Ferguson, Josie Obiama, Dr. Maurice Southwick, and so many others, you can catch these on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. Our official radio partner is Red FM, Bajate Raho. Today's session is the Ramcharitmanas, Pavan K. Varma and Shashi Tharoor in conversation, a session that examines the deep philosophy and continuing relevance of the Ramcharitmanas written by Goswami Tulsidas in Awadhi in the 16th century and the impact of this path-breaking text on Indian culture and society. Pavan K. Varma is an award-winning writer, diplomat, and now in politics, where he was till recently a member of parliament in the Rajya Sabha, and earlier an advisor to the Chief Minister of Bihar. He's the author of over a dozen best-selling books, including Ghalib, The Man, the Times, The Great Indian Middle Class, The Book of Krishna, Being Indian, Becoming Indian, and Chanakya's New Manifesto. His latest book is the greatest ode to Lord Ram, Tulsidas's Ramcharitmanas, selections and commentaries. Shashi Tharoor is an author, politician, and former international civil servant. Dr. Tharoor straddles several worlds of experience and currently is a third-term Lok Sabha member of parliament, representing the Thiruvananthapuram constituency. He has previously served as Minister of State for Human Resource Development and Minister of State for External Affairs in the Government of India. He currently chairs the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Information Technology. During his nearly 3-decade-long prior career at the United Nations, he served as a peacekeeper, refugee worker, and Under Secretary General. He's also the award-winning author of 20 books of both fiction as well as non-fiction, including The Great Indian Novel, The Paradoxical Prime Minister, The Hindu Way, The New World Disorder, and An Era of Darkness. Please do remember to comment and ask questions by typing it in the comment section. In case you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can find us on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. And of course, if we drop off, no, you can't blame Shashi, but just hang in there and I promise we'll be right back. Ladies and gentlemen, Ramcharitmanas, Pavan K. Varma, and Shashi Tharoor in conversation.
Thank you very much, Sanjoy, and I'm delighted to see that my friend Pavan has produced yet another extremely well thought through, very well researched, very well presented book, this time on the Ramcharitmanas, which of course is a 16th century work, written, as you already said, in Awadhi. But what is significant is that it was written in Awadhi in an era in which the great epics were only declaimed in Sanskrit. Valmiki's Ramayana, which was the tale that, of course, was told for many, many centuries before Tulsidas, was in Sanskrit. But Tulsidas decided to write in Awadhi and did so in an extraordinary epic poem, which is considered one of the greatest works of Indian literature. It's been called the tallest tree in the magic garden of medieval Indian poetry. It's been called the greatest book of all devotional literature. And of course, there is no question that Pavan Varma, who has dipped into Hindu philosophy, both in his book on Adi Shankara and his book on Krishna, is particularly well equipped to get into the essence of Tulsidas's work. So I'm going to ask Pavan to take us through what he's tried to do. I will steer this conversation, but let him do most of the talking, but this is really a way of presenting this wonderful book to all of you. I should stress it's a book written in English for the English reader, which has a lot of verses transliterated from the Awadhi into both Hindi and English. But Pavan and I will be talking in English, so knowing Pavan is quite capable of bursting out into quotations in Awadhi as he talks. Pavan, tell me, Tulsidas has tried to make the story of Ram accessible to the layman, and you have chosen to make the story of Tulsidas accessible to the English-speaking Indian reader today. Tell us about what led you to this and how you saw the epic poem that you're presenting to all of us.
First, let me thank JLF for this opportunity. Nowadays, friends find it difficult to meet, but thanks to their amazing platform, I am speaking to Shashi, whom I have not met personally for very long. So it's a great pleasure, Shashi, to be in conversation with you.
Good to see you, Pavan.
Shashi, the Ramcharitmanas is an epic. It's over 12,000 lines, and it's in Awadhi, which, of course, to those who know and read Awadhi, is something that democratized the epic from Sanskrit to Awadhi. And actually, it's become the Bible of North India for a lot of people who understand Awadhi. But my aim, whether with Adi Shankaracharya, my previous book, or with the Ramcharitmanas, is to take these great works, not only of literature, of storytelling, but of philosophy, and about Maryada Purushottam Ram, of course, to the people at large. Many people will not read the Ramcharitmanas from page 1 till page end. So my idea was to take out from my point of view some of its most scintillating passages and to provide English and a Hindi translation, so it's not exclusively for the English reader, and then to provide a commentary on those stanzas so that people get to know a little more of the meaning, the context, the background, the characters, and the evolution of a story in the larger context of Hindu religion and mythology. So that was my purpose, because I believe, Shashi, that even if you are an atheist, and by the way, Hinduism allows for atheism, as you know yourself, but the sheer literary effervescence of Tulsidas as a poet is such that you read the Ramcharitmanas at three levels. One, the story of Ram. Two, the parallel philosophical time I'd like to elaborate upon between Nirguna and Sagun divinity. And thirdly, the nuggets of wisdom which he hides in the telling of a story, which have become almost proverbs in the usage of ordinary people in their daily lives. So, therefore, the purpose was to naturally take the Ramcharitmanas to a bigger audience outside its traditional speaking world, and to make people aware of this great work of literature and of philosophy and of religion.
Thank you, Pavan. No, that's very important for everyone to understand. It's also important, I think, to recollect the historical context. Tulsidas was writing in the era of Emperor Akbar. He was a contemporary of Shakespeare, and he was writing. He himself, I think, was a Brahmin, right? And he was himself a big admirer of the
Goswami. He's called Goswami Tulsidas.
Goswami Tulsidas, but he was writing something which he wanted ordinary people to be able to sing, to read, to recite, even to perform. I think the whole Ram Leela tradition starts with the Ramcharitmanas. But there is also, and I will come to Nirguna and Saguna later because that's an interesting issue. But before we get into that complication, let's just understand one important thing. The bhakti movement, of which the Ramcharitmanas is clearly seen as an important part, because the bhakti movement involved the popularization of Hindu devotionalism in a way that marks a significant departure from the Hinduism of Adi Shankara that you've written about so well, which was, of course, a much more philosophical, intellectual Hinduism, though he also wrote some beautiful verses that people were meant to recite and listen to. But what happened with the bhakti movement, which began, I'm pleased to say, in the south, but traveled all the way up to the north and became very much widespread, was that people started focusing on their own devotion. We have great visions of Mirabai dancing herself almost into a state of bliss. Tulsidas elevated Ram, and that's where I'd like you to tell us a little more about his contribution in the bhakti movement towards the devotion to Ram. but also whether Ram was ever worshipped in quite such a major way before Tulsidas, as became possible across North India once Tulsidas had written Ramcharitmanas.
In my view, Ram, a more popular deity than Ram, let us say, from the Hindu pantheon, which, as you know, loves to extravagantly humanize their gods and at the same time believe that all gods are one, emanations of that one pulsating cosmic consciousness called Brahm. So, the more popular deity perhaps was Krishna, and there's a reason for it. From the Harivamsh to the Vishnu Puran to the Bhagavad Puran, and most definitively with Jayadev's Geet Govind. The whole bhakti movement of Krishna, and incidentally Shashi Radha doesn't exist in any book until Jayadev. She's not there in the Bhagavad Puran, she's not in the Vishnu Puran, she's not in the Harivamsh. In all of them, Krishna dances his Ras Leela with a anonymous group of gopis. But Jayadev created Radha as the sensual foil to Krishna. If he was Shringar Mutimam, she became Raseshwari. And Chandidas, Bihari, Surdas, and others took it forward to the ordinary person. If there was someone who performed that service for Ram, it was Tulsidas, without a doubt. It's not as though the Ramayana and Ram's story was not popular before that. Remember that the Ramayana by Valmiki was written before the Common Era.
Yeah.
And after that, you've had many versions of the Ramayana. In fact, those who wish to devalue Hinduism often use this very diversity to try and prove that there is nothing such as a united corpus called Hinduism, which I don't agree with. Hinduism nurtures this diversity. So there are many versions of the Ramayana, and one of the more popular ones is from the South Kamban's Ramayana. And there was then there was Tulsidas. So if Tulsidas, at least in North India, was the person who made Ram the Patra, the focus of absolute surrender and devotion, bhakti and prapatti. But again, it's very interesting, and if you'll allow me a minute more, you see, bhakti movement is again intrinsically linked to Hindu philosophy. Shankaracharya, as you mentioned, wrote about Advait Hinduism, the non-dual, Nirguna, attributeless, cosmic consciousness pervading everything and immanent in everybody. But it was much too dry a concept, perhaps, however valid it may be, and no section of Hindu philosophy has ever denied the validity of Nirgun Brahma. But they have derogated from it, again through a philosophical discourse. So after Shankaracharya came Ramanuja, who had the school of Vishisht Advaita. And then there was Nimbarkar and so on and so forth, who kept whittling down, as it were, but through a philosophical discussion, the concept of absolute non-duality to a slightly qualified non-duality, which would allow for the deity or the divinity to have attributes which were directly accessible to the devotee. And so that movement moves from there. And then we have the bhakti movement coming to its apogee, or to speak, its culmination in from about the 11th century onwards till the 16th and 17th century, both for Sri Krishna and Sri Ram. And they are themselves important in the fact of the complexity and nuance of Hinduism. Krishna is Leela Purushottam. For every Krishna, you need a Ram. For every Ram, you need a Krishna. For every Radha, you need a Sita. For every Sita, you need a Radha. And that is a part of the complexity of Hinduism and its ability to nuance even the divinity in many ways. Ram was probably a less lovable character than Krishna, who was absolutely adorable as the stealing child, the adolescently precocious teenager, and his many avatars in the Bhagavad Gita during the Mahabharat war and so on. Ram stands for the epitome of rectitude, the correctness of social order and behavior, the perfect role model for the ordinary human being. And so Tulsidas says, now that don't fall into the trap of Nirguna or Saguna, because he's now a proponent of the Bhakti school, as you mentioned. So he says, Aguna Saguna doi Brahma Swarupa, Akatha Akatha Anadi Anupa. Both the Nirguna and the Saguna are part of the same Brahma. And therefore, the only thing that is important is that you practice bhakti for that Sagun Roop of Ram, who is also the Nirgun Brahm. So he will say, Tulsidas will say, Agun Arup Alak Ajajoi, Agun Nirgun, Arup formless, Alak Ajoi unborn, Bhagati, Bhagati Prema Bas, Sagun Hajoi, that attributeless divine, because of the sheer devotion and surrender of the devotee, becomes from Nirgun, attributeless, to Sagun, attributeful. So it is that philosophical discourse that comes into the movement of bhakti. And Tulsidas's attempt is to say, yes, the Nirgun is valid. Yes, the Sagun is valid. Ram straddles both worlds, and for the devotee, don't fall into this philosophical polarity. Just accept Ram as the emanation of both and find your salvation not in the philosophical quibble of which category he belongs, but by complete surrender to Ram himself.
Absolutely, Pavan. I agree totally with the way you presented it. I take it back slightly to say that the whole debate between Nirguna Brahman and Saguna Brahman, of course, took over 1,000 years to evolve, because the initial Vedic concept of God, the original Brahman idea, was very similar to the Islamic notion. That is, a God, that a divinity that was completely formless, shapeless, could not be sensed by any human perception. Was it a spark? Was it an idea? Divine was everywhere. It suffused all of us, etc. And that was the Nirguna Brahman.
Why did you say it was similar to Islamic notion?
The Islamic idea of Allah is exactly the same, that you cannot visualize, cannot imagine, cannot give any shape to it. It was exactly the same concept. The Muslims went in a different direction, that's a different story. But to this day, Allah cannot be imagined by human mind. And I think the original Hindu sages had much the same thought, that you cannot imagine the divine. Think of it as a force that permeates all creation. But then the problem was that for human beings, because of their own limitations, that was not enough. And so even in the Vedic era, people were worshipping trees and mountains and rivers and so on. And the early debate started that if God exists, God must be imaginable. People should be able to come to worship. And so what the Brits referred to as our mythology was a way of giving divine attributes, extra special attributes, to characters whom people could imagine, could visualize, and who at the same time embodied some of the qualities of the divine that we wanted to see present in our lives. Ram is actually a particularly interesting variation of this, because he is, as you said, first of all, a human being, as well as a human being of divine qualities, and at the same time, a model human being. Maryada Purushottam is the highest of all human beings, and with the greatest qualities that every human being can aspire to. Now, not every woman can aspire to be Durga and ride a tiger of 10 hands, but every man can aspire to emulate Ram. That seemed to be the message that was coming across. And I don't know if you think that's a fair thing, but of course, when you look at the way in which Tulsidas reconciled Nirguna and Saguna, that was indeed very impressive. He was also, of course, doing an end run around the other debate, which says that there are 4 ways in which you can manifest your admiration for the divine. There is Jnana Yoga, which of course is what Adi Shankar specialized in, the yoga of knowledge. There is Bhakti Yoga, which is what Tulsidas was, after all, writing about. There is also Raja Yoga, the interiority of meditation and so on. And there is Karma Yoga, the yoga of action, which many of our gods can be said to have actually exemplified through their work. But in some ways, one could argue that just as most human beings are not capable of Jnana Yoga, but are capable of Bhakti, Tulsidas was giving them a tool that both allowed them to practice bhakti and at the same time remain, if you like, with fealty to the idea of jnana. Is that too much of a stretch as a theory?
Well, I would say that Tulsidas specifically in the Ramcharitmanas says, please don't get into the other paths that can lead you to moksha. Among the four Purushars, ultimately we are all aspiring, if Vivek or discrimination comes to us, of that ultimate bliss associated with moksha, either while still living or subsequently. But Tulsidas says, don't get into the other margs. The only efficacious marg, from his point of view, is bhakti. He writes that the only thing that matters is your surrender to Lord Ram. And I think that, in a sense, makes him, without any reservations, entirely a proponent of the bhakti school. And he believes everything that you and I in our temporal world. He says, Janani Janak, parents, Janani Janak, Bandhu, friend, Sutta, son, Dara, wife. Janani Janak, Bandhu, Sutta, Dara, Tana, Dhana, Bhavana, house, Suhadra, Parivara, family, relatives. Sabki Mamata Tag Batori. Weave them into one cord. Mama Pad Manahi, Bandh di adori, and come and tie it at my feet. That is sufficient for you for salvation. So, I mean, this is not to reduce the what I call the remarkable refinement and sophistication of Hindu spirituality, but to say to you clearly that for Tulsidas, the bhakti marg was the only efficacious marg. And why is he the perfect role model, as you said, for human being? Because in circumstances of, I'll give you two examples. Here he's meeting Kaikeyi, his stepmother, who has conspired to see that he's banished for 14 years into Vanavas. He loses his throne. He's being unfairly being punished as a part of conspiracy. And so Ram goes to meet Kaikeyi. And what he says to Kaikeyi has become part of the common man's imagination in very many large parts of North India and through, of course, the story across India. He says, Suna Janani, listen, mother, soy sut bada bhagi. That child is most fortunate. Suna Janani, soy sut bada bhagi, jo pitumacha patan anuragi, who can with love obey the commands of the parents. So he holds no vengeance, he shows no anger, he is the embodiment of equipoise, of calmness. He realizes, and by the way, this is the amazing duality again of Hinduism, that at one level as God he knows that it's all part of a Leela. At another level he plays the human role of going through it and actually moving towards one path, but he shows no anger. And sometimes when I see vengeful Ram, I want to say to them that, of course, Ram is not a passive God. Ram fights against injustice. He even takes up arms against injustice, as he did against Ravan. But Tulsidas believes that even in that fight, even against his opponent, Ram will follow the framework of being Maryada Purushottam and will never injure another or harm another without adequate reason. So I must quote to you two lines out of Ramcharitmanas, which I often do in debates when people talk about an irrationally angry Ram. In Tulsidas's Ramcharitmanas, Ram is telling Bharat, and these are beautiful lines, Shashi. पर हित सरस धर्म नहीं भाई पर पीड़ा सम नहीं अथमाई there is no greater virtue than the welfare of the other and no greater sin than an injury to another. So this is Ram as always correct even when fighting against injustice, bound by the code of his essential persona, which is that of Maryada Purushottam.
Right. I mean, I think one episode, I don't know if it figures in the Ramcharitmanas, but from Valmiki's Ramayana is the Surpanakha episode, which shows Ram in a, shall we say, less calm and reasonable light. I mean, somebody comes to try and seduce you and you knock off her nose. How do you explain? Is that episode in the Ramcharitmanas?
It's a very popular episode even in the theatrical enactment of the Ramcharitmanas because it is a lighter moment. Sarupnaka tries to seduce Ram and he passes her off to Lakshman and Lakshman passes her off to Ram and this is going on between the two brothers and finally it's Lakshman who cuts off cuts off the nose of Sarupnika. So I mean this is part of and this is dramatized and performed across Southeast Asia. This is a fairly popular scene.
I've even seen a Philippine dance ballet of the Ramayana, not to mention, of course, the wonderful Indonesian Bayang Kulit episodes. And also seen the Ramayana, by the way, as the brand name for the most popular clove cigars of Indonesia. So the Ramayana's influence has also been somewhat secularized. One thing, since you mentioned the Ram Leela performances, and of course, people are very familiar, have been remade familiar with the Doordarshan, B.R. Chopra version and so on, is that the Ramcharitmanas' 1,000 odd stanzas, the 12,000 verses you mentioned, are actually divided into 7 kans, right? 7 books or episodes. These kans, actually, the first 2 make up more than half the work, and that's the Balkand and the Ayodhya Kand. So that the action stuff which comes in the Aranyakand, the forest episode, and the Kishkin, and of course the whole Lanka and so on, 5 Khans are actually less than half the book. So that in fact, Ramcharitmanas is much less into the action part of the Ramayana narrative than the popular imagination of the Ramayana story would normally embrace. How then did it do so well in capturing the imagination of the public, given that it devotes itself much more to the childhood and the shaping of the man, of the Maryada Purushottam, than his actual adventures, which have captured the imagination of the young?
You're right, because Tulsidas now was writing in Avadhi about a central deity of Hinduism and writing in Avadhi against the established tradition of Sanskrit. And he was a learned man. So he wanted to also use the Ramcharitmanas to tell the world that it's not as if he's an ignoramus, writing writing again a story that has been written earlier and which is familiar to people. So he, in a sense, revels in his knowledge of both philosophy and the many gods in Hinduism and pays tribute. Right in the Balkan, for a very long time this goes on, tribute to all the gods, and a very serious discussion on the many aspects of Hindu philosophy. So you're right, that's takes up much of the space of the Ramcharitmanas. That is why I thought that a selection would be a good idea. Because you can now present, instead of people having to read it from page 1 till the end, you can choose. I mean, I have chosen selections which give you a flavor of the Ramcharitmanas and with the meanings given and the context given. But I agree with you that the Ramcharitmanas is in that sense disproportionately structured, but it doesn't miss out any of the action.
Okay.
It doesn't miss out any of the action because the story is quite linear. And some of the verses, by the way, in North India, Shashi, the whole uh, relationship, the beauty of the relationship between Ram and Sita as depicted in Ramcharitmanas, from their first meeting to the Jaimal. Even in my family, even today, when a Jaimal is held and the bride and the bridegroom exchange garlands,
Mhm.
additionally in the family, the lines are sung from the Ramcharitmanas.
Wow.
Sakhin madhya siya sohati kaise, chabi gana madhya maha chabi jaise. So she is like that great portrait among a fleet of portraits as she comes forward towards Ram for the Jaimal. Tulsidas's depiction of Sita, I mean, it's absolutely Shashi's sublime poetry. I mean, and it's philosophical. He says, "Sundarta kahi sundar kari." Even the beautiful, she makes more beautiful. Chabigrah deep shakha jan ubare. As though in a home hall of portraits, suddenly someone lights a lamp and all the portraits come alive. That is the kind of beauty she has. So those relationships are very beautifully essayed in the Ramcharitmanas. And there are characters, how do you visualize Shashi Lakshman? He's a somewhat angry, hot-headed man who's always there to come to the defense of Ram, and is angry with Surupnakha and so on and so forth. We've seen the characterization even in theatre. Now Tulsidas will give even to Lakshman in the narration, in the narrative of the epic, the conversation between him and Nishad Raj, who's the boatman who takes them across the river when they are going into exile, Shashi. Suddenly he asks Lakshman, I feel sad at your plight. You are from the royal palace. Here you are sleeping on the ground, eating the fruits and things available in the forest. And Lakshman suddenly becomes philosophical. Now, this is the genius of Tulsidas. He says to him, Kahu na koi sukh dukh ka data, nij krit karam, bhog sab brata. Nobody, my dear friend, my brother, is dispenses joy or sorrow to people. Everybody gets the fruits of the actions that they have committed. Now, this is Lakshman and he dilates at great length. The genius of Tulsidas is Lakshman asks him about Brahm, Maya, and Jeev. Now, you are familiar in Hinduism of their pivotal roles in the notion of philosophy. Now, Lakshman asks Ram to explain them. And here is Tulsidas now getting away slightly from bhakti and having the means of this dialogue between Lakshman and Ram for Ram to explain to Lakshman what is what. And there's one line in which he explains Maya. Mai aru more tor te Maya. The notion of I, mine, and yours is Maya. That is the illusion created in our empirical world. The one line, Mai aru more tor te Maya. That is the genius of Tulsidas.
Pavan, we've run out of time. I should turn to the audience. Just one thing, since you and I are also writers and been dealing with other attempts, there was the one English translation of
There's something the problem with your sound, Shashi.
beg your pardon?
There's some problem with your sound.
Okay, now I was just saying that.
It's much better now. Yes.
So, as a writer,
Yes.
you have probably looked at have you looked at the only well-known English translation of the Ramcharitmanas by Frederick Grouse in the 19th century? There's really been nothing significant since then. There are supposed to be English commentaries, as one by Morari Bapu, the Mangal Ramayana, and so on. But yours is obviously a path-breaking work. Have you seen Grouse's translation, and what do you think of it? And how would you tell the readers why yours represents a departure from that sort of approach?
No, I think that it's a very good translation. Of course, I've gone through it. It's sometimes a little, by today's standards, arcane in the sense of the language it uses.
Archaic, yeah.
So I think that it's very easy to simply translate the Avadhi. The Gita Press has done an excellent job and it's been in print for now decades of both the English and the Hindi. You can make your choice as far as translations go, but the simpler the better from my point of view.
Okay, great, Pavan. Well, thank you very much. I've got the warning that audience questions are due now. I'll hand this back to Sanjoy Roy, who will moderate the audience questions to both Pavan and, if necessary, myself. Over to you,
Thank,
Sanjoy. Thank you, Pavan, and really good luck with all success for this excellent book.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
thank you, Shashi. Thank you, Pavan. The first question that I think needs some explanation is come from some of our viewers outside of India, and they want to understand what when you say Nirgun and Shagun, what is it that you're referring to? Because there's no real translation. So if you could simply do that, and there are hundreds of questions. So
Okay.
Well,
Very
I
quick, very quickly,
go ahead.
uh, Hinduism has six systems of philosophy. I won't go into their technical names, but each of them is a quest for what could be the ultimate truth. So technically, they are almost atheist. They are not talking about God. They are talking about what could be the ultimate truth. Of these six systems, perhaps the most powerful in the evolution of his Hinduism was the one called Uttar Mimansh, which is also called the Advaita school, which means that that ultimate truth or that ultimate reality is beyond form, beyond thought, indivisible, all pervasive, attributeless, complete in itself, immanent in everything. It is that all pervasive cosmic consciousness, all knowing, eternal, neither born nor will it ever die. And the world that we live in is a, is an illusion that arises from that reality and goes back to that reality. It's an illusion based on a misperception or an error of perception on our part that makes us see the transient, the temporary, the unstable to be real, and that which is permanent, which is stable, which is eternal, which is pervasive to be unreal. That in short is the notion of Nirguna. Nirgun Brahm. It's called Brahm, or as is spelt in English, Brahman. That Brahman is the ultimate reality. Now, typically in Hinduism, there arose from this Advait school other variants of philosophy very powerfully argued, which said that the ultimate may be attributeless, but it can permit of, it can itself permit of certain attributes to be also associated with its all pervasive divinity. And therefore, the Sagun school came up, which said, yes, that attributeless reality is there, but it also allows for a deity which has attributes which you can worship, to which you have access, to which a devotee can go to surrender. And this dialectic in Hinduism between Nirguna, that attributeless ultimate, and the Sagun, which is the attributeful emanation of that ultimate, that dialectic continues until it is bridged by the bhakti school, which says that, frankly, that deity, that divinity could be Nirgun, could be Sagun, but your salvation lies in absolute surrender to him or her. It could be Devi or it could be Ram or Krishna or Vishnu or Mahadev. So this dialectic is very, very essential to the ability to understand Hinduism, because as originally elaborated in our philosophy, there was no God. The Upanishads don't mention a God almost. The six systems of Hindu philosophy, with the exception perhaps of the Yoga school, which is part of the Sankhya Yoga school, there is no mention of God. It's only a search for what could be the ultimate truth underlying the bewildering plurality of the world as we see it. And that is the audacity of thought of Hinduism.
So facetiously speaking, sort of Zoom is the bridge between internet and the World Wide Web and our reality, roughly speaking. But Shashi, you wanted to add?
Yes, yes, I just want to add a word to what Pavan said. In many ways, the good thing about the whole saguna concept is precisely that it recognizes the limitations of human imagination. The difficulty that human minds had in conceiving of the inconceivable, the unimaginable, the untouchable, the idea of the divine that had no qualities, no attributes, no shape, no form. That was recognized by permitting the notion of the Saguna Brahman and the idea that indeed, fine, since none of us really knows what this looks like, imagine it as you wish. So if you want to imagine God as a 10-armed woman riding a tiger, that's perfectly fine. You want to imagine God as an elephant-headed human being of some corpulence. That's fine too. And similarly, if you want to imagine the divine as a bleeding man suffering on a cross, that is actually acceptable in Hinduism. Because Hinduism says that all ways of worship are equally valid because they all end up at the same Brahman, the same divine, the same absolute. And in many ways, this interesting debate that Pavan has so ably summarized for us is a way of feeding into this larger acceptance of all ways of worship and all forms of worship, which is what makes Hinduism a uniquely universal faith, in that every other religious form is acceptable because of this fundamental transcendent principle.
In
But I
fact,
think I know we probably
just to add one line to what Shashi said, the Upanishads sum it up by one sloka. Ekam sat vipraha bahuda vadanti. The truth is one, wise people call it by different names. That sums up what Shashi was saying.
exactly.
Perhaps our present government is unaware of that. But moving on to Pooja Sood asks a very interesting question, and this is for Shashi. Shashi, given the relevance of the story today across faiths, does this lead to regressive social behavior, misogyny, and emphasis on religious beliefs? And a question to Pavan, Sudhir Tandon asks, was Kaiki actually the baddie she's been made out to be? Or was her real motive in sending Ram to exile to make him realize his true potential and in the process extend his kingdom? So who wants to go first?
I think Pavan should go first. It's his book, but it's a lovely question. And I'll
Well,
come.
I must say that in Hinduism, and especially in its philosophy, there is nothing absolutely right and absolutely wrong. I'm not saying that it is permissive of a.
Slippery slope. It's the slippery slope where everything is okay.
That's true because you are dealing with man-made rules, and man-made rules cannot be absolute because even geographically they vary. What is permissible somewhere is not permissible somewhere. So the Hinduism always, I mean, in terms of its social thinking, contextualizes what is correct behavior and creates many exceptions to the notion of absolute right and wrong. So, I mean, just to give an example, when Yudhishthir, accompanied by a stray dog, ultimately enters the portal of heaven and is the only one of the Pandav brothers who does so, he is surprised to find that Duryodhan is having a rather good time in heaven while his own brothers and Draupadi are in hell. When Duryodhan, who's supposed to be the arch villain of the Mahabharata, he dies, the heavens rain down flowers on him for being a good Yodha, for having fought by the rules till the end for what he thought was his right. So there is a contextualization, which only Hinduism, I think, among the great religions, allows for consciously because you are dealing with man-made rules and customs. Now, in the case of Kaikeyi, again, this is what I call the harmonious schizophrenia of Hindus, the ordinary Hindus' devotion. Kaikeyi is depicted as the baddie, to use your phrase. But in the Ramcharitmanas itself, as also in other Ramayana versions, she is acting on the behest of the gods who, unknown to her, who want Ram to go into exile in order to exterminate the asuras, the demons. So it is all at one level engineered, of which Keikei is unknown to herself, playing a part rather than being absolutely wrong. In the Adhyatma Ramayana of the 15th century, Sita is never abducted by Ravan. Ram says to her that Ravan is coming to abduct you, so go and sit inside the hut and put an image of yourself outside, and that will be abducted. So Sita has remained constantly in the hut, while her kaya, her form has been abducted, taken, and finally released. Now, this kind of duality of even normal popular narratives is well known in Hinduism. So, Kaikei also will probably find a place in heaven.
Coming back to your question to me, I would say that to the young lady who asked it, or the lady who asked it, that to some degree the question is not fair to Tulsidas and the Ramcharitmanas. I think you are referring, when you mentioned patriarchy, to the ending of the Valmiki Ramayana and not to because the business of Ram hearing of public suspicions of Sita and allowing her to disappear into the earth in a furrow is not in the Ramcharitmanas that I have read. Now, Pavan can correct this. It is actually not in the Ramcharitmanas. Ramcharitmanas has them coming back and assuming the throne with Narad and Sanaka visiting Ayodhya to meet with Ram, see the great city, and even Lord Shiva coming to glorify Rama, which is another story of Vaishnav Shaivite debate, which we don't have time for right now. But at the end of it all, there is a complete digression into the biography of Saint Kakbushundi, and there isn't actually this particular episode of the abandonment of Sita. So I don't know. I think many would say that it's a somewhat abrupt ending. Again, Pavan may have a view on why the Ramcharitmanas ended quite so abruptly without a sort of neat tying together of the Valmiki story. But in any case, the patriarchy is largely absent. In fact, I would argue that that's not so much an issue. As to the question of popularization of religion, I would simply leave you with the thought that there are so many different versions. The main unifying strength of the stories of these epics is quite simply that through the tales, a certain exaltation of values takes place amongst the listener or the reader of those tales that leads them towards devotion. That, in any case, is the idea. Just as in Christianity, the parables and the stories in the Bible are very much part of this holy book, including some fairly, shall we say, scandalous stories are also included. In the same way, we must have in the epics stories which can be relatable to by the ordinary public. Now, the one interesting distinction I used to make, and I think I've become a little more skeptical of my own distinction, but I'll make it anyway, is that the Mahabharata is more of a secular epic, and that the only truly divine character in it is Krishna, who may well have been interpolated at a later stage when the Bhagavad Gita was put into it. But the Ramayana is a divine epic. It is seen as a sacred text. I remember my grandmother, literally there is a Ramayana month in Kerala where particularly ladies of a certain age would simply recite the Valmiki Ramayana every single day for a month. It's a widespread practice in our society. And it's that sort of thing. The Ramayana is, unfortunately or otherwise, that depends on your own inclinations, placed above the kind of debate or sacrilege that I felt free to undertake with the Mahabharata when I reinvented it satirically in my novel, The Great Indian Novel. I wouldn't, as a Hindu, I would find it difficult to do that to the Ramayana. And when a writer called Aubrey Menon tried it in the 1950s in a story called Rama Retold, a rationalist retelling of the epic, the book was banned and still remains banned in our country. So I'll hand you back to Pavan for the last word, but I would simply say that the religiosity that you are worried about is not emerging from the Ramcharitmanas. The Ramcharitmanas is telling you a story that should actually encourage you to be a better human being and to worship an ideal, as it were, of an imaginable form of divinity. But the religiosity that comes out of, if you like, television adaptations or other kinds of things may be somewhat more sectarian. I think that's what the questioner was implying. But as you've heard Pavan and me now over a couple of books each on the subject, I think you realize that religiosity or an interest in Hindu philosophy, Hindu ideas, and Hindu teachings actually has nothing to do with sectarianism or political Hindutva, which is a totally different thing. And in many ways, some of us would argue, as I have argued, I don't want to put words in Pavan's mouth, but let me argue that in many ways, the ideologies that are divisive and that use Hindu religion to beat others on the head with are fundamentally un-Hindu in my view, and are a betrayal of the Ekam Sat Vipraha Bahuda Vadanti philosophy that we have been taught consistently throughout the text of Hindu philosophy. I'll leave it there. There's a lot more we can say.
Well, Shashi, as you know, this is the age of or era of darkness, as you've said. Knowledge is at a premium, and people don't necessarily read, nor are they interested in actual fact, and we've seen the consequences of that. I'm sorry, my colleagues have sort of said we have to stop. There are hundreds of questions, but I'm going to ask Pavan to end with Hemant Gehlot's question. No, sorry, not Gehlot. Om Prakash has asked Pavan, can you tell us about the great Sanskrit poetry at the start of every Kand, which contains deeper bhakti darshan than his chopais in the main text? But we'll have to, I'm sorry, I know it's a huge, you can do an hour on this, but I'll have to ask you to do it.
No, I'll tell you why Tulsidas uses Sanskrit to begin with. Because Sanskrit was the language that great poets who were writing an epic, at least in North India, used. And also in the South. I mean, Sanskrit was a pan-Indian language of the cultured, of the elite, of the knowledgeable, of the educated. And here was Tulsidas, who decided to write in Awadhi. So it was a break of tradition. In fact, Tulsidas against him by Pandits who believed that any epic not written in Sanskrit is not worth reading. And so one way that it was tested was that a number of Ramayans were put in the Kashi Vishwanath temple in Varanasi, and the doors were closed at night, and they said, let's see whether your Ramcharitmanas figures somewhere. And ultimately, it was when the morning when the gates were opened, it was right on top with Shiva's signature, Satyam Shivam Sinduram, which also bridged the schism between Vaishnavism and Shaivism, which Tulsidas does very consciously. But Tulsidas still has to begin.
Pavan tells the story in the book. It's there in the book.
Yeah, but Tulsidas still begins with Sanskrit. And also uses Sanskrit occasionally. Namami Shamishana Nirvana Rupam Vibhum Vyapakam Brahma Veda Swarupam Niham Nirgunam Kalpam Niriham Chidaka Shamaka Shavasam Bhajayam. He uses Sanskrit, this great stotra to Lord Shiva by Ram. And Ram's Shiva's tribute to Ram. Jai Ram Rama Ramanang Shamanang Bhavtab Bayakul Pahi Janam Avdesh Suresh Ramesh Vivo Sharanangat Mangat Pahi Prabho. So here are both gods paying tribute to each other, and therefore Hinduism retains its essential unity, which by then it does. But Sanskrit was the tokenism that had to be done. The opening lines.
Let me add one more point to what Pavan said in the answer to this question, which is that this Mangalacharan at the start of every chapter is actually invoking the gods for a blessing so that the writer can finish his sankalp without any trouble. So in other words, because traditionally all invocations to the gods for blessings were in Sanskrit, he really had no choice but to have those. The first 3 or 4 verses of each Kanda are basically these invocations in Sanskrit. Pavan has many of them in the book. And so the Balkan, for example, begins with him honoring goddess Saraswati, who is the goddess of learning, and the god Ganesha, who of course is the auspicious god, the god you go for every inauguration of everything, or starting a marriage, or all of those things. And so in many ways, he is, I think, as Pavan was hinting in his answer, assuring his potential critics that he is within the mainstream, he is within the tradition, he is seeking the blessings in good old pious Sanskrit of the appropriate gods, so that he will have their blessings, and in the Mangal, with all the Mangal of the gods, he will then be able to go ahead and complete his Sankalp in a way that is satisfactory to the gods. And then,
Perhaps.
similarly, having done it in Avadhi, he goes into the next chapter and starts again with an invocation. I
So
think
the
Ayodhya
next,
to Shiva, for example, and so on.
so next time we have you, Shashi, we need you to start with one of those Mangalam so that the audio sorts itself out, and we could have had a wonderful session. But seriously, I mean, this is, we've done one session and there's hundreds of unanswered questions and so much to go through, and we really need a series. And we would love to have you back to continue this conversation. And I'm so sorry, everybody. I know all of you have sent in these wonderful questions, but do forgive me for not being able to ask Pavan and Shashi those questions. Maybe I can send some of them forward, and they can write out the answers, and we will post them on. Thank you all for watching, and thank you to our official radio partners, Red FM Bajate Raho. Please remember to log on at 8:30 p.m. IST this evening, and 4 p.m. British Standard Time, 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time for our next session, Monsoon Ragas, the music of the rains. Catherine Butler Schofield and Vidya Shah in conversation. Every season is celebrated in India through its poetry, music, and art. And as the rain clouds spread their shadows, acclaimed music historian Dr. Catherine Butler Schofield, an accomplished vocalist and writer, Vidya Shah speaks of the power and splendor of the monsoon ragas and the stories and emotions behind them. Thank you all for watching. We've had 1 million views across the JLF Brave New World chapter, and it's all thanks to each of you and our wonderful speakers. See you back at 8:30 p.m. Thank you.